Well, good morning. It's Monday, and today we're going to focus on special projects. What are special projects? Well, basically, that would be anything that is not a diamond painting pen. Special projects are usually kits that you get from some of the vendors like Penn State Industries, Exotic. They usually have a tube going through them, and they have parts that you need to assemble by pressing into these tubes. Now, our business is centered around diamond painting pens, but we also do a lot of business making these kits. In a previous video, Carol went through and organized all these blanks. If you've watched that video, you might have noticed that there were a lot more papers on this table. That is because I have started to move them over to my side, so we weeded it down a little bit and reorganized and moved them down a row, basically. Let me take you over to my station and show you what I got going over there. Of course, this is going to vary week to week on how I set things up. But basically this time around, I put a piece of plywood down, and projects that are sitting on top of that plywood is what we're going to start with. These are in date order, but we also are cognizant of customer names so that we don't have to ship multiple boxes to the same customer. We tend to try to lump things together for the same people. Also, when I do special projects, I am also aware of the type of pen kits. For instance, if I have 5 or 6 of the same kit, I pretty much try to do them together within reason so that it's just easier on me. So what's on top of the plywood is what I'll be working. And then I'll just pan around a little bit, and that's going to be my assembly area right there with my pen press. And of course, we have our little green instruction book if I need it. From a turner's perspective, special projects is a fun time for me. It's a break from the routine. You never know what you're going to encounter. Diamond pens are pretty straightforward. You just got the basic shapes that you turn, and you turn them through the day. Special projects can throw all kinds of surprises at you. You have all kinds of hurdles that get thrown in your way that you have to overcome. Some days they go real smooth and you can just fly through them. Some days it's just one challenge after another, and it's like you're swimming upstream and you just get to the point where you just have to quit, and it's just not happening today. On top of the chaos of trying to keep multiple kits in your mind. Every kit is got its own peculiarities, how it goes together, what you have to do to assemble it. Take, for instance, Carol mentioned the Longwood kit I have in this batch. That's over on the other table for tomorrow's work. But the Longwood is one in particular that you got to kind of stop and change the way you do things just for the way that kit's assembled. It's not hard. It's no harder than any of the other ones. The problem is it's different. And if you get into a rut and you just start turning pens, you're going to turn that one, you're going to make a mistake. The key to all of this is to eliminate as many mistakes as possible. You got to think things through. Another thing you might have noticed watching Carol set up these pens in a previous video, it might have crossed your mind, well, how does she know she has the right blank to the right paper? Could she make a mistake? Yes, absolutely she could make a mistake. You might have 3 of the same blank going to different customers for different pens. And it does happen. But every step of the way, whether it's diamond pens or these special projects, every step of the way we have sanity checks. We have 2 people working, and we're constantly looking at things. And when I go to a kit and I have let's just say a slimline kit, and I have one barrel sitting there instead of 2, and it's, 10.5 millimeter, it's like, well, that's not the right blank for this kit. So it's a sanity check. So I find the problem. Oh, okay, there's the slim line over here. So we kind of keep our eye out for each other. And every step of the way you do double checks. I got to make sure when I pull a pen from this stack of paper that it is the correct blank, that it's going to the correct kit, that it's the correct customer. I've got to make sure I have the correct bushings. And then I've got to understand the directions of the kit. Now, I've made so many pens, basically, most of these I know by heart how to make them. But there are exceptions, and you get brain farts. It's like, I forget how to do this one. So you have your green book to fall back on. You can look at the instructions. And I'm not one of those guys that, I'll just throw the instructions out. I'm a real man. I don't need instructions. I do need instructions. I read instructions. I read instructions very thoroughly before I start, so I know what I'm doing. Now, I think that's part of the key to success in this hobby, is to understand what's going on before you actually get in there and do anything. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent and getting on my soapbox, but long story short, I have the chaos of a special projects day. I've got a lot to keep in mind every step of the way. And now to add to that, I'm trying to make videos and I'm trying to figure out how to piece this together. So I think tentatively what I'm going to do is create this video on special projects in general, and I'm going to complete one kit. But also I think I want to video every kit, at least the turning and assembly, and maybe do them in time lapses. So that's our general plan for the day. And if you're ready, we're going to start. The first step in the process today is going to be to grind these ends down right even with the tubes that are inside. The danger here is you don't want to go too far, because if you shorten that tube, you're going to shorten the barrel of the pen, and the pen's not going to fit together right. You want to grind this until you just start seeing the brass of the tube and stop right there. Now, I want to get on my soapbox again, and I want to say this very clearly to especially people that pick this up on YouTube. And I am not RJB Woodturner. I'm not here to teach you how to do this. This is not a tutorial. I don't really care how you do it. You probably have better ways than me. That's great. This is how I do things with the equipment that I have. I've been doing this for a long time. I'm not claiming to be an expert, but I have sold many pens. This is just simply how I do it. That said, how we got to the point where we're at now is we took the blanks and we opened the kit instructions for whatever kit it may be, and we cut the blank oversized, but two size to fit whatever pen barrels or keychains or whatever the project requires. We cut the blank down to length, and then we drilled a hole into that blank with whatever tube that we have to put in, provided the kit needs a tube. Some of these kits don't need a tube. Next, we paint the tubes with a white spray paint. We do this because a lot of our blanks are see-through blanks, and you will see the tube inside the blank. So we paint the tubes, usually white, although we can use different colors when the need arises. But usually they all get painted white regardless of whether or not the blank's see-through. And then when I glue them in, I use a 2-part epoxy with a 15-minute work time. And I put a little bit of white dye in the epoxy so that it too, on the see-through blanks, that you don't see glue blobs, you see white. This is the setup that I use. Now, it's not the only way to do this. They do sell an end mill that basically goes in a drill motor, and it does have its advantages. The thing you need to watch on this one is that you need to keep the tube square to the disc. Now, the setup that I'm using right there, you could actually make a mistake And if you go by the blank instead of the tube, you might not be square to that tube. If your blank is crooked, if it tapers, or if there's any problems, say you drilled the hole a little bit off center, you're going to have problems in your fit. I do it this way because I drill on the lathe. Most of the blanks that we use are fairly uniform. Everything's square. I made sure that my table is square, my miter gauge is 90 degrees, and I'm using a piece of hardwood that doesn't have any flaws or defects. So I know pretty much that I'm going to be fairly close to 90 degrees when I do this. But if I go to put the bushings in, and I notice that there's a gap on one side, it's tight on the other, it's not totally square, then what I do is I come back and I do use this tool here. And what this does is it rides on the tube and it'll make sure that what you're grinding is totally 90 degrees to that tube. And you just want to kiss it. You don't want to take too much off. Again, the big danger in this is losing too much of the tube. That said, I'm going to turn on the vacuum dust collector and turn this on, so I'm not going to be able to speak, but let's go ahead and get this done. Now, like I said, I was very careful. I'm using a 120 grit disc, and this disc is wore out. I actually like when the disc is wore down because I don't like being super aggressive. 80 grit is just too aggressive. You grind down too quick. But if you notice, I check constantly. Every pass, I'm checking to see where I'm at. And I just got to the point where I just hit the brass. So we're good to go here. The next step is pulling our bushings. All of our bushings are labeled in here. I know the Princess pen is going to be PR pen. It's alphabetized. I just work my way down. PR pen for Princess. Now we've got to put our bushings into the pen blank. Before I do that, I usually like to take a file and I just like to clear out any paint overspray, epoxy, anything that might get in the way of a smooth fit. It also smooths out the brass burrs that you get on the ends of the tubes, although that's usually not a problem using the disc grinder. Using an end mill, that's more of a problem. But I take my time, visually check the tube, make sure everything's nice and clear. And it chamfers the edge out a little bit so that when you're pressing your parts, it tends to go in the hole a little easier too. And you can hear there's a rough spot right there. So I'm just getting rid of that edge and I'm putting a chamfer on it. Now, Princess pen, you have a bottom barrel, you have a top barrel. The bottom's an 8mm tube, small bushing, center bushing, top's a 10mm tube. So you can't really get these backwards. It's pretty foolproof. Okay. Now I'm about to open Pandora's box. Here comes the fodder for the trolls. Here comes the big debate. Basically, in turning in general, this has got to be the biggest debate I've ever read on Facebook. And people get so uptight and antagonistic. My way's the only way. You're an idiot for doing it the other way. How do you turn writing pens on a lathe? This setup is called a pen mandrel. What you do, and most bushings are set up for a pen mandrel. And this is what the basic way to turn a pen is. You slide the kit on the bushings on this pen mandrel. You slide up the tailstock. You want to have a firm pressure, but you don't want to torque down on this. And now your pen's riding on this shaft. These are spacer bushings, by the way. They're just 7mm bushings used for turning slim lines. We use them as spacers. By rights, I really should take one out. I'm close to the end. But what's the advantage of using this setup? The advantage is you can do both barrels at once. Even more so if you have like aromatherapy necklaces, which are really short. And if you have 3 sets of bushings, you could do 3 aromatherapy necklaces at the same time. So what's the downside to using a pen mandrel? Let me show you. I don't know if you can pick it up and hear it, but it's got vibration. I don't care. Brand new out of the box, this shaft will never run true. And this one right here, this particular one, I bought brand new to replace one that was kind of really bent. This one's worse than the one I replaced. It's just not true. So what happens because it's not true? Well, as you're turning, as you might have seen in my diamond pen videos, it bounces. And you leave chatter mark. You're not real accurate to the bushings. Finishing is a problem, especially when you use a CA finish. You get ripple and stuff. In general, it's just a very bad way to go about doing this. But, again, you can do 2 barrels at once. And for somebody like me, with the projects I have laid out, I'm experienced enough to work around the pitfalls of this. It's not necessarily a detriment to what I'm doing. Now, let's go to setup number 2. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, turn between centers, turn between centers. That's the way to do it. You turn between centers. No, this is a stub mandrel. You're still using a mandrel. It's smaller than 7mm. A 7mm tube will fit perfectly over this. And then the bushings, you can space it out for bigger tubes. But the downside of this is you basically can only do 1 barrel at a time. However, an upside is you can use your regular bushings for this. So these are just regular run-of-the-mill mandrel bushings that I can put on here on these stub mandrels, tighten my tailstock down, and now I have a lot smoother ride. There's no vibration there, it's smooth. Where would I use this? I prefer to use this method. This is actually my way to turn, but the downside is you can only do 1 barrel at a time. And when you got a whole pile of, this say cigar pens, I mean, I'm doing cigar pens 60 at a time. And if I were to do that, if I did a barrel at a time, that's 120 times I would have to take the blank on and off the lathe. I don't want to do that. So in that case, I use the pen mandrel. But if I have keychains, crochet hooks, I would prefer to use this setup. Third setup is the ubiquitous, everybody yelling, turn between centers. These are centers. You got a dead center because it has no bearing in there. It's just a piece of metal that revolves with the lathe. And then this is a live center because it's on a bearing and it's free to spin. Now, you can use regular bushings, run-of-the-mill bushings, and turn between center setups if you have to. But it's not ideal because you've got, I believe it's a 60-degree angle on this. You want a bushing that's got the same 60-degree angle inside so that it really runs true. This has a 90-degree flat, just like a tube. And yes, it's centered on the point, but it's not ideal. I will use this setup at times. I have used this setup. It's really no different than using the stub mandrels though. But this is the one that if you go into Facebook, everybody, you got to turn between centers. And to an extent, they're not wrong. If you want to be accurate, you really need to turn between centers. Now that that's out of the way, let me put on my pen mandrel and we can turn this princess pen. All right, back to setup one. I think a lot of the problem that people have with the mandrels is you really got to watch your spacer bushings, especially the one that's against the pen bushing. You want to make sure it's a fairly new bushing that's got a 90-degree sharp edge on it. What happens is, I don't know if you can see it in the camera, but there's a dip in this one. You can see it's got a belly. They get beat up as you use them. They're really cheap metal, and as you're constantly pushing the tailstock in, you're squashing these bushings and they get out of true. And I think that's one of the main reasons people have trouble. It's not the bent mandrel. It's more that the spacer bushings they're using are shot, and you just need to buy more spacer bushings. Again, I mentioned it before. Tip number 2 is do not tighten your tailstock down real tight. You want to tighten it down enough that you stop the blank from freely spinning. But I don't know if you can see it, but I'm turning the wheel and I'm holding the blank steady. I still got some slop in there. That blank is not real tight. You want it just tight enough that you can turn. All right, I'm probably going to time lapse this. You don't need to sit here and watch this in real time, but I'm just going to go ahead and turn through this and polish it, and I'm going to put a CA finish on it. Here we go. And there you have it. Notice in the end I was demonstrating as I squeezed it, I was stopping it from spinning. It's not held on real tight. Something I want to look at now, the fit between the bushing and the pen. I want to make sure they're all nice and tight. Also, when I was turning, another tip is you don't quite go down to the bushing surface. Leave just a little bit. I'm talking a 32nd, 64th of an inch. I mean, just, you're even working into hundredths, I guess, but just enough that you're going to sand more material off and make that flush. Another thing, the Princess kit in particular, the front nib on the pen kit always stands a little bit proud. For whatever reason, the bushing's undersized. So I always leave just enough to catch your fingernail on, but a little bit more meat on that. And even at that, when I assemble this, you'll see I'm still going to be a little bit proud. It's just a feature of the kit. It's what the kit is. There you have it. Next step, let's go over and assemble it. Camera angle is going to be a hard one with this. This is about the best I can do, and I don't think you really want to see my face as much as what I'm doing. So I set it up like this. Something I did not mention when I was on the lathe, everything I do, I try to be uniform. Uniformity helps prevent mistakes. If you do different things all the time, you're not really in a routine, you can get confused. If you do things the same way every time, it helps your brain. When I turn, and I guess you're sideways, so you're good that way. When I put this on the lathe, I always tend to turn with the nib of the pen toward the headstock and the back of the pen toward the tailstock. It really throws me when I look at some of these instructions. I don't know if you see that, but in the book, some of the instructions actually are backwards to that, and you really have to stop and think. You're flipping things around in your brain. For whatever reason, though, I tend to prefer the nib to be toward the headstock. I like to do my pens in batches. This is why I like to do Princess pens together. I try to do cigar pens. If I can keep things together, it saves a lot of work. But rather than turn a pen and assemble a pen, which is what you're going to see in the time lapse, the reality of what I do is I spend time turning a surplus of kits, 10 kits, 20 kits, depends on what I'm building. But I'll lay them out on the table. I'll lay the kit that goes to the blank, and then I lay the turned barrels like that underneath the kit. And I'll line up turned barrels to assemble, and then I can assemble in a batch. But the key to this, again, is uniformity. I want the pen as it would go together. I want the nib, the center, and the finial. And I lay all my pens out that way. You probably might not see it, but these are kits to be turned. They're laid out. That's the finial end, the center end, nib end. The blanks are laid out according to how they're going to go with the kit. Just thought I'd drop that in there. When you're batching stuff, if you're a hobbyist and you're turning one pen at a time, this stuff doesn't matter. But when you're doing things in batches, it's important to keep things together in your brain anyway, so you can figure out, you don't make mistakes that way, I guess is what I'm trying to say. While Carol's good at sitting and chatting, I'm not a real chatty person. I generally, believe it or not, I don't know what you see on the videos because I'm talking on videos, but I'm generally a quiet person. I don't do much talking. I'm a behind the scenes person. A lot of people like to be on camera, like to be the center of attention. I'm the opposite. I'd rather be in the back of the house, just do my thing, leave me alone. So it's kind of a stretch for me to be doing this, actually. So keep that in mind as you're watching this. I am a little rough around the edges. I will be the first to admit that. All right, so you lay your parts out. I've built so many, I don't generally worry about the order they're in, but for a beginning turner or a hobbyist, it helps to identify your parts and know what you're doing. So you have the finial cap is going to get pressed in the finial end. you have the bottom center band gets pressed into this one. The transmission will screw into that. The nib goes on the other end of that one. And then you have the center cap goes on that one. So I'm going to start with this. Now, a key to remember, if you have any kind of hang-ups, if it doesn't want to halfway enter that hole, stop and figure out why. Don't ever force this stuff. That's a novice mistake. There's a reason it won't go in. Figure the reason out. Don't just force the issue. Now, you want to keep things square. I use this kind of pen press. You want spacer blocks. You want to figure out how it's going to fit. So I'm going to take that one out. Now let me show you another little trick using a pen press like this. I like to pull the lever toward me as opposed to working sideways. But something else, try to keep this handle at 90 degrees or towards you for leverage. If you are out here like this and you're trying to pull up, you're not getting the proper leverage on this. I know my arm's in the way. I'm a righty. I can't do this left-handed. So I hope it shows through. But basically, I'm tight against the blocks. This is spring-loaded. So, it holds. I'm at 90 degrees, or close. Now, I just want to make sure that I keep this thing square and very gently pull it towards you and press it in. Again, don't force the issue. It's hand fitment. If it doesn't want to go in there, figure out why. Is there a burr? Is there a lump of CA or epoxy, depending on what you used? Figure out why it doesn't want to go together. And now I've seen people like RJB Woodturner, Bob. Bob uses the bushings themselves sometimes. He keeps the bushings in and uses the bushings, and there's nothing wrong with that. By all means, you want to be gentle with these raw edges. You can split this and break this. You can pull it off the tube. There's all kind of crazy things you can do with this. So again, just take your time. Look at what you're doing. Be careful. Everything's square. No sudden movements. Very gently, very methodically. Push it in. Now you're going to have to give it a little bit of force to seat it. But you don't want to grill it. You don't need to be a Bubba and just, horse it down as hard as you can go. Springs. You're not going to pick this up on camera probably. On these nib springs, usually there's a narrow end and there's a wide end. If there's not, and if the spring's uniform on both ends, look at the number of wraps on the end. You want the most wraps and the widest end to be what seats against the nib. So I'm putting the narrow end of this spring. Again, I don't know if this is going to show up, but that end is narrow. So I want that end to be what goes on the pen. You want as much surface area down here pushing against that nib as you can. Okay? Seat your ink cartridge, screw on your transmission. Now it's time to test it. Does it retract all the way? If it does not retract all the way, you've got problems. You pretty much got to start over. But that's a good fit. Now we'll work the middle. And these two are different diameters. So if you get this swapped around and confused, your pen's not going to fit right. Through this whole process, you need to make sure that it stays aligned. That's the center, that's the finial. They are different diameters. So I'm going to press the center in first. I'm going to need another spacer block or two. Very gently push it in. And then the finial. Now one thing I like to do, I like to look at the blank and see where that clip's going to look best. Sometimes you can cover up the not so good sections. Now something I will never cover up damage. You can look on your clips, you're never going to see the crack that everybody tries to hide, the chip. If you're cracked and chipped, I'm going to stop, get another blank, we're starting over. I'm not going to sell that to you. But That said, there's a white patch in there where the glitter's not so heavy. So I'm going to put the clip over that. Now the drawback is if you see it on the sides, the clip's going to draw attention to it. So you keep that in mind. Sometimes you got an accent on your blank. You want the clip to be on the pretty side that you're going to look at. As the pen's laying on the table, it's going to naturally go to that, and you want that to catch your eye. But in any case, be cognizant of where you put the clip. And I'm going to take the small, and that gives me a little bit more leverage. And again, very gently, push it together. Now here again, how do I push this together? I don't just randomly squeeze this together. I'm going to look at the blank. Wood grain. If you have a wood blank, match the grain. You want your pen to match in the closed position. This is a twist pen. You want it to match when it's in the closed position, not the open position. Where do these blanks line up together? This one's pretty random. I don't guess that it matters too much. I like the heavy gold right in here. So I'm going to put the clip with that gold. Push it together. And a princess pen is born.